Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
2 weeks ago, I said we were going to do 2 episodes on the topic of dispensationalism. Not because we want to impress people with the big words that we can use, but quite simply because dispensationalism could bring about the end of the world. It's the original source of a set of ideas, a theology, that focuses on a future global war between the Christian church and Israel on the one hand, and an evil global empire on the other hand, and ultimately results in the complete destruction of our planet. And by letting their dispensationalist ideas shape their values and guide their actions in the world today, evangelicalism may well contribute to the actualization of that global war. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's what certainly seems to be, especially in the current climate. You know, it's certainly very, very relevant. Daily, we hear not just religious people, but just general secular people as well, talking about the world in apocalyptic terms.
Mm-hmm. But even back to the religious world, they're basically saying, if you read between the words, let's kind of get this war happening so Jesus will come back soon.
There is that element.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that later on. But before we get into the weeds with our expert today, I want to say a few words to our listeners because in today's geopolitical climate, any discussion that focuses on Israel is a hot potato, a lightning rod for all kinds of distracting commentary, accusations, and distortions. So I want to make absolutely clear to our listeners, and to any potential critics and protesters actually, what we're not talking about today. This episode will not be addressing the morality of modern-day Israel's military actions. It will not directly address Hamas or Gaza or Iran or you name any other Middle Eastern country. I'm going to do my best to keep our discussion focused on American people, evangelicals almost exclusively, having pro-Israeli opinions and even crafting Middle East policy and military support largely because of their Sunday school level understanding of the Middle East and the impact that that has on global affairs and global peace. I want to highlight the fact that they think there needs to be a state of Israel based on theological reasons. They have theological explanations for every aspect of Israeli politics, economics, governance, and policies, but they don't have a theological reason for Greenland's independence from Denmark, or any theological-based opinion about China and Taiwan, or India's disputes with Pakistan, or a long list of other countries and geopolitical military disputes. And so we're focusing on that misplaced infusion of theology into one small part of the larger geopolitical arena. And we're not putting the spotlight on any Middle Eastern people of any kind here. Instead, the spotlight is on Americans acting, for the most part, on American soil.
I think that's a really important point because there's certainly lots of that kind of rhetoric going on. And in light of the current situation, it is a very important topic and it raises lots of emotions, but it's really not the focus of our thesis here,
Exactly.
And our guests' work as well in this
Right.
area. So,
well, speaking of our guests, we have a great expert lined up for this very complex conversation. We're going to talk with Dr. Daniel Hummel about how this theological construct, which I'm going to refer to as a mind virus a couple times later on, how it made a global impact through its influence on American evangelicals. Dr. Hummel did his undergrad training in philosophy and history and a master's degree in history at Colorado State University, then did a PhD in history, mostly at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with a couple of years of that PhD training taking place at the Rothberg International School, situated on the Hebrew University campus in Jerusalem. In his postdoc years, he lectured in history and public policy at Harvard University, and he's now a lecturer and research fellow in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as the director of the Lumen Center at that university. So Dr. Hummel, Daniel, if I may, welcome to our podcast.
yeah, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Daniel is great. It's a pleasure to be with you and talk about this topic.
Excellent. Daniel, director of the Lumen Center. That sounds interesting and maybe intimidating. What is the Lumen Center and what do you do there?
Sure. Well, it's actually not affiliated with UW. So we're right across the street from the university. It's privately funded. I work for a Christian organization. The Lumen Center is basically a think tank. We gather scholars who are in various disciplines, both humanities and sciences, who are practicing Christians, who are thinking about their scholarship as a service to the Christian community. In Christian lingo, we call it the church with a sort of capital C, the broad Christian community. And so we both value the expertise and the rigor of a place like UW-Madison. And many of our fellows, including me, lecture periodically at UW in our given departments. But we also direct most of our writing and research and speaking engagements and so forth to more the public audiences. You could call it public scholarship in a way. Seeing a huge gap between the sort of conversations that go on in the church world and then the knowledge in the university world and trying to bridge those. So it's a new initiative. I'm very thankful for the opportunity to do this type of work. It's really fun work to do. It's fun to be hanging out on campus most days with students and faculty, but also be very involved in the church communities here in Madison and other places around the country.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. So I went to seminary and so on and did a degree and everything. And then I ended up taking a different branch for my career and going into IT and software development. And what always bothered me was that because I had some academic training at church, the gap between that academic training and when what was generally offered to the typical layperson in church. And often pastors and so on would dumb things down, kind of assume that the audience is about a high school education. And yet the fact is, at least in my church, it was full of engineers and doctors and lawyers and, well-educated, thoughtful people who deserved, in my mind, a lot better. And so I really endeavored in my own teaching in those settings to bring that level and do exactly what you're talking about. So it's very encouraging to hear that you're doing that work, because I think it's, and I think as we talk about this topic today, we'll see just how relevant that is. If that had been done better, maybe we wouldn't be maybe at the place that we're at, with some of these things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Even part of the vision for the Lumen Center came out of my experience writing books about Christian Zionism, dispensationalism, and realizing that I actually had a very good way of talking about these topics in an academic setting. If I was giving a talk at a university or at an academic conference, but that, those ways of talking don't actually resonate with most people in churches who aren't familiar with those settings. And so, part of this is just a communication challenge. It's how do you talk to different audiences with the same truth that you're trying to share. But yeah, it was just a real recognition for me as a younger scholar that I've been trained really well in a certain way of talking, but that doesn't necessarily translate. And I think for many scholars, they really do want to have an impact beyond their subfield. They really do want to make the world better in the other institutions besides the university, but there aren't as many places like Lumen Center that are really built to do just that type of bridge work. So yeah, it's an interesting space to be in. And I think a lot of my work around Christian Zionism, in particular in the last 2 or 3 years, has been shaped by being here and actually thinking about that daily. How is what I'm writing going to be received by different audiences, including a bunch of people at an evangelical church or a Catholic church, alongside experts in the field who are reading about this stuff.
Speaking of your scholarly work, I did want to get your thoughts on the 2 books that you've already written. You're still young in your academic career, but you've got 2 books to your name, which is impressive. The first one sounds incredibly relevant to today's topic. The title goes, Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S.-Israeli Relations. So, Daniel, can you give us a thumbnail sketch of that book?
Sure. So this came out with University of Pennsylvania Press, academic book. It was my dissertation, a heavily revised dissertation, turned into a book. And my core interest here was trying to trace the history of the Christian Zionist movement. And I make a distinction between the movement and, you could say, Christian Zionism as a set of ideas. Those ideas have a very long history, going back at least to the Reformation, if not earlier. And they've been with us since that time, but they haven't always turned into a broad political movement. Part of that is that you need democratic governments and ways of politics to actually create broad movements. But part of that even is in American history. We don't have Christian Zionist movement for most of our history. It's really in the last, you could say, 50 or so years that there's a grassroots populist Christian Zionist movement. So my question was, how did that come about? And I guess a sub-question of that was, what role did the state of Israel play in understanding what was happening in America, and then ultimately elevating or privileging certain organizations or even leaders to develop their relationship with American evangelicals? So the backbone of that research was actually spending time in Israel. That's when I was at the Rothberg Institute. doing archival research in the Israeli archives, going through their government documents, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Ministry of Tourism, going through basically starting in 1948 when the State of Israel was founded, and then going through until I basically ran out of available documents, which at that point was in the early 80s, and just piecing together the story. So some of that story is in English, a lot of it's in modern Hebrew. Unfortunately, you can't even do that work anymore in the same way. They have, since this was in 2012, 2013, since then, they've really restricted access to the government archives in Israel. You now have to request specific files and they'll scan them for you and send them. And so you're trusting that they're scanning everything in the folder. And of course, a lot of this work, if you know any historians who will talk about this, you don't actually know what you're going to find until you're going through them. It's not like you already know which document you need to look at. So anyway, that's all to say, I'm not sure what a student today would be able to do. They'd have to do it differently than I did it. But the overall argument of Covenant Brothers was one, really trying to understand, okay, we have this theology of dispensationalism that features Israel a lot in it. What role did that play in developing the modern movement? And it turns out it played a significant role, in part because a lot of the early founders of Christian Zionism, of the movement in the 60s and early 70s, came out of dispensationalist backgrounds, and it was really animating their thinking. But then also in later iterations, including when people like Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye in the 80s were quite prominent, and then John Hagee, who's still quite prominent, they all come out of a dispensationalist background. So, of course, it's an important role. But I also wanted to say it's not the only thing that's animating these people. And in some senses, it's not really the one that explains how they become so politically savvy. The two others I really emphasize are what is particularly prominent in John Hagee's teaching, which is an idea of almost like a prosperity theology for supporting Israel. This comes out of Genesis 12:3, where God is talking to Abraham and he says, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. If you've been following the news, Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson just sort of debated this verse just a few weeks ago. But this is I would say this is actually the thing that unifies Christian Zionists more than any other sort of proposition, is that God's going to bless those who bless Israel. So this is often tied to dispensationalism, but it doesn't have to be. There are plenty of Christian Zionists who are from other parts of the world or just from other traditions besides dispensationalism that believe that God will bless those who bless Israel. So that was one thing I wanted to sort of trace the history of how do we even, who started saying that first, who started pointing to that verse, all that kind of stuff. And then who actually made that institutionally viable. And then the other, and maybe this is the least obvious component to this, but it was really important to me to understand this movement, was that it's a post-Holocaust movement. So any engagement with Christians and Jews after 1945 is in the shadow of the Holocaust. And this is particularly true on the Jewish and Israeli side. As they were looking at Christians who supported them, they were framing that support in sort of a post-Holocaust sense, both that they were desperate for friends, particularly from the Christian world, because a major interpretation of the Holocaust in the Jewish and Israeli world was that Christians perpetrated it. It wasn't just the Nazis. It was confessing Lutherans and Catholics who were the soldiers in the camps and all that kind of stuff. So they were very concerned about Christian theology. And they also evaluated their sort of potential allies on their views of the state of Israel as sort of a theological proposition. So there's a lot of sort of reform happening in the Christian world after 1945. You can think of Vatican II sort of reframes how the Catholic Church thinks about Jews and Judaism, the World Council of Churches on the Protestant side, and then evangelicals who don't have those types of big world entities to make theological changes. Evangelicals were having those conversations as well, particularly about the way that many Christians, even in their own evangelical tradition, were anti-Jewish in their theology, if not anti-Semitic, and particularly this idea that dispensationalists stood against, which was that the church replaced Israel as God's chosen people at the time of Jesus. And dispensationalists did not believe that, and we'll get into that, but dispensationalists believe that the church and Israel are both covenanted peoples with God. And so this was a major, you could say, selling point for dispensationalists during the 1960s and 70s, is they could say, hey, we have never taught this really problematic theology that sort of infects a lot of the rest of the Christian world. And so there are many examples of evangelicals who are apocalyptic in their views of the end times and so forth, who also framed their relationship with Jews as a friendship gesture of reconciliation after the Holocaust. And if you listen closely to someone like John Hagee today, it's all over his language. Even with Iran and Israel opposing Iran, it's the idea of like Israel doesn't have a lot of friends. We Christians need to finally stand up with the Jewish people. And a word like finally is contrasting what he's doing to what Christians in the 1940s didn't do in his view. So anyway, that was the first book, is tracing all those things and really trying to draw it up to the present. I think I talk about the embassy move as sort of like one of the last events before that book goes to publication. So that was like 2018. The U.S. moves its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as this very symbolic gesture of support. And that's one of the things that the Christian Zionist movement had been advocating for decades, among other people. It wasn't only them advocating for it, but that was really just trying to explain this particular part of U.S.-Israeli relations, and particularly how this theology has animated a big chunk of the evangelical world. And I didn't realize, I was writing that during the first Trump administration, that really, I'm a historian. I'm not really trying to like cater everything to the moment the book comes out. And it's an academic book, so it took like a year longer to come out anyway. But I think even looking today, people like Mike Huckabee are now in the administration who are perfect examples of this tradition and embody a lot of the values that I talk about and are still really close to the action of U.S.-Israeli relations.
Yeah, wow. I mean, listening to you trace this out just underscores to me, this is a complicated issue. There are many streams that run into this river. It's
right.
Yeah, it's not dispensationalism being maybe a major one, but certainly by far not the only. Because I even think back, and maybe you can comment on this, but the famous Balfour Declaration, right? Where Lord Balfour says, I think right after the First World War, was it after the first? Yeah, he makes this declaration that the Jews should have a homeland, right? So, do you have any background on that? Like, obviously he's not a dispensationalist, so where's that coming from?
Right. I believe it was 1917. I think it was right during the war that the Balfour Declaration happened.
Okay.
Yeah. So Balfour himself comes out of a very pious evangelical upbringing.
Okay.
He was not that's part of the next book I wrote was on dispensationalism. And part of that is showing that dispensationalism, as we think about it today, is really an American phenomenon. It has some Plymouth Brethren roots in Great Britain, but there are very few actual dispensationalists in Great Britain. But Balfour was part of a much bigger tradition. I would say that's the Christian Zionism with a sort of ideology behind it, particularly in Reformed or Anglican Protestantism that looked to what they would call the regathering of the chosen people in the Holy Land,
right,
as sort of one of the things that was promised in biblical prophecy. And that comes out of a particular way of reading those prophecies and reading the current situation, of the time with the world of Jewish people in history. So I would say Balfour is a cousin to dispensationalism. He doesn't hold some of the same apocalyptic views of the rapture and things like that. But dispensationalism is just one variation of a much bigger tradition of, you could say, Protestant apocalyptic views of what's going to happen with the Jewish people. And a lot of them have to do with the refounding of a nation state that's supposed to be in continuity with the ancient kingdom that would happen. And so Balfour saw himself as actually being able to, fulfill the prophecy with his own actions, or at least set up the conditions for that. And so that's sort of a theme within this whole, we were talking about Balfour or John Hagee or someone like that. There's an excitement and even a profound honor that they feel for being able to be part of God's plans of world redemption, essentially. So for many outsiders, it looks like megalomania or something like, wow, you think you're actually, doing God's will or something. And that's a fine analysis. But I would say from the inside, there's a very strong sort of sense of seriousness about this. What an honor, or what a blessing, or what a responsibility it is to actually fulfill, be in the time and place where God's going to fulfill these things he promised thousands of years ago.
Right. I remember seeing the movie, which was very, very popular years ago, and probably still to some extent, of the Dutch story of I'm just going to slip my mind right now. The lady that hid the Jewish. Help me.
Corrie ten Boom.
Corrie ten Boom.
Yes, Corrie ten Boom. And right in that movie, the father says we must bless those who bless Israel. This is his reason for hiding the Jewish people there. This has nothing to do with, obviously, with dispensationalism. I mean, these are Dutch Reformed people, right? But
Right.
there's still that very basic belief. There's something very special about these people in this nation that Christians need to support. So, yeah, all that to say that dispensationalism then becomes, I guess you might say, an expression, one of the expressions of this. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And it has this very unique history in American culture that makes it sort of the dominant expression, at least for a time, that makes a lot of people just associate with, oh, this must be the entire tradition or something like that. So you can see that blessing language is all over the place in Protestantism. And I think the difference with someone like the modern Christian Zionist movement, someone like Mike Huckabee or John Hagee, is there's a particularity and a material blessing part of that is much more focused and much more national based as well. It's like nation based prosperity theology. So it's not just about you individually accruing good things in your own life. It's actually about the fate of your country that's at stake. And Hagee talks about that all the time. And that would be different than like the Ten Boom family or something like that,
Right.
where, well, I actually don't want to speak for them because I haven't read enough about them. But my guess is the primary thing here is sort of an individual command or a command for the individual Christian to bless the Jews in their life versus my entire country's fate hangs on how I do
Right,
this.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then there is your second book that you wrote, published with Eerdmans Press. The title is The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, How the Evangelical Battle Over the End Times Shaped the Nation. And I've got to say, Daniel, the book cover is pretty ominous. It's got a massive firestorm consuming buildings. It looks to me like a nuclear blast. And to your credit, you've got a great foreword from a very influential Christian historian, Mark Noll, author of The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. We spoke to him over a year ago. If people are interested, episode 157. So kudos to that. Mark put one particularly great phrase in that foreword. He said that you, quote, take a story that everyone knows and shows that what everyone knows, in air quotes, has barely scratched the surface. So can you tell us about that second book?
Sure. And I take no credit for the cover. That was outside my hands. I think they were going for the same color palette as The Late Great Planet Earth
Yeah,
from the
okay.
1970s, but had like a flaming Earth on it, which is the book I talk about. I also think there's a metaphorical reading of the cover, which is it's called The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. And part of my argument about the fall is it's sort of a hollowed out husk of a theology at this point. Sort of, I heard someone say it's a zombie theology. It's sort of it's still walking around with us, but the brains have sort of stopped working. So there's a sort of metaphorical of like a bombed out cityscape or something like that. But yeah, so the goal of this book was to really, for the first time in about 50 years, you do a survey of the history of dispensationalism as opposed to fundamentalism or evangelicalism or apocalypticism, all these other important terms. It really wasn't it was the mid 60s when the last survey of dispensationalism to be told. And then our understanding of what the origins of dispensationalism were had been pretty significantly changed as well by really good scholarship by other scholars since the 60s. And so it's a narrative. It starts in the 1830s with John Nelson Darby, the founder of the Plymouth Brethren, an Anglo-Irish priest in the Church of Ireland, who then leaves and creates his own movement. And then I trace his ideas and the way that particularly Americans adopted and then adapted his ideas in the 1860s and 1870s, basically creating the basis of what we call sort of popular white evangelicalism of that era, Dwight Moody being the main revivalist who adopts some of these ideas. And that era really creates the institutions that become core to evangelicalism in the 20th century. The Bible Institutes that are still with us in a lot of ways, places like Moody Bible Institute and Biola in California. Biola is an acronym for Bible Institute of Los Angeles, and so many others. These are less prominent now, though they're still around, which are the Bible conferences. These were really important networks that were in the 1880s, 1890s, sort of the lifeblood of evangelicalism. It's where pastors went and met and learned from each other. And then the mission agencies that spread the gospel all around the world in the late 19th century, many of them founded by dispensationalists who had a passion for reaching the lost before the end was to come. And so that's sort of where, you still have some similarity to Darby's ideas, but boy, they've changed a lot because Americans have their own purposes for these ideas that are much different than the Plymouth Brethren. And you really get the basis of a dispensational subculture in this period. This is sort of like going into the fundamentalist era. And then there's a big shift in the story as fundamentalism severs off a big chunk of conservative Protestantism. And I see dispensationalism as being a major tradition that sort of forms fundamentalism, but it's not the only one. It's alongside a very like hard reformed covenantalism, and these are sort of opposing camps. And I think you can read a lot of the 20th century evangelical church and seminary life as a basically a contest between these two subcultures and how they're vying for dominance within the fundamentalist world. And they build seminaries and they, create academic journals and they populate denominations, and they're each sort of claiming to be the most faithful way to be a Christian, a fundamentalist Christian. And that story is a really interesting one, and it might be interesting for religious historians, but maybe not many others, except that as a product of this competition, dispensationalism develops a massive popular following, in part because some of them intentionally try to popularize the theology outside of the seminary church world. And that's where Hal Lindsey's Late Breaking Planet Earth comes in. That's a 1970 book. Hal Lindsey was trained at Dallas Theological Seminary, which is sort of the epicenter of academic dispensationalism. And Lindsey's book becomes, according to the New York Times, the best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s. And it creates an entire sub-industry of what I call pop dispensationalism. But basically, the end times theology of dispensationalism, which talks about a rapture and an antichrist and the state of Israel, very bloody, very violent. There's sort of a whole industry of books that are purporting to analyze the news in this mode. There's movies, there's novels like the Left Behind novels in the 90s, there's music. It becomes a sort of whole subculture. And it goes pop in a way that very few sort of theological traditions go pop. And I see that as both a really consequential thing for our culture, our religious culture. It's also it sort of makes dispensationalism, it hollows it out in a way. It makes the sort of gatekeepers, not the theologians at the seminaries, but the people who can market the theology the best. And that tends to be televangelists or novelists. It largely adapts itself to commercialism and a type of conservative politics that gets picked up by the Tim LaHaye's and the Jerry Falwells and the Pat Robertsons in the 1980s. And at the same time, it is declining rapidly in the seminary world. And that's part of the story that I just felt had not been told yet, that between 1960 and 1990, dispensationalism moves from the center to the margins of evangelical seminary life and becomes really discredited by the 90s as a viable sort of theological tradition to get trained in, unless you're within the dispensationalist world, which is a shrinking world at that point. And one of the things I wanted to just highlight, because I live in more broad evangelical world still, is most of the seminaries are not dispensationalist. Most of the theologians and biblical scholars are not dispensationalist. And yet from the outside, it seems like dispensationalism is what is equated with evangelical theology. And I wanted to sort of just unpack that and understand why why is that perception there, but also what is the reality? And how do you explain things like, I don't know if this name resonates with you all, but Tom Wright or N.T. Wright, a major British New Testament scholar who's written books against dispensationalism, just taking it on. And he's one of the most popular writers for evangelicals in America. How do you make sense of something like that? So I came to the conclusion that dispensationalism it's fallen in its academic credibility to such an extent that its future really looks like a folk or pop theology. It will continue well into the future. I didn't ever mean fall to mean disappearance or something like that, but a fall in the quality and in where you're going to find it. I think there will probably be left behind type novels 100 years from now that will probably be popular, maybe as popular as they are today, but that will be a sort of type of theological offering that's pretty thin, that's really about eschatology and not much else. Dispensationalism, in its academic sense, has views on all types of things, not just the end times. But most people don't know that because all they consume is the pop stuff. And then the pop stuff also gets just conscripted into political and commercial projects over and over again that make it not very inspiring, at least from the outside, as a way of living or as a way of like shaping your life if you're a Christian. So I end that book as close to the present also as I can, talking about some of the ways, though circumspect, because these things are still evolving, but how dispensationalists have, contributed to ideas like QAnon and other very sort of contemporary conspiracy theories. Again, some of those connections are more on polling than on like actual people, and I'm always skeptical to sort of indict an entire tradition based on polling. But there's definitely a conspiratorial mindset to pop dispensationalism that is very resonant with a lot of the ways, particularly on the right, these conspiracies today about the government, about public health, and so forth are being talked about. So I end there, sort of reflecting on this is one of the major legacies of dispensationalism, and it's something that is still going to be with us. But it's also something that I think you can only understand how it got to where it got by taking a much fuller history of how academic theology and culture and pop theology all sort of work together or worked against each other at various points to produce what we have today.
One of the baffling things about the climate we're in right now, especially with the current president, is how evangelicals, in a very big general sense, have been very supportive of him. And in fact, pretty much the key to his political success, I would say. If he hadn't had the evangelicals, I don't think he would have gotten to become the. And how is that possible when these same people that are conservative morally and so on, and they know, that they don't agree with Trump's lifestyle? Right? And do you think that part of that is because that's okay with them because they just see him as a pawn in this whole thing? He's just part of God bringing about the apocalypse. So even though he may not be a good person, they see some of his policies, and especially the pro-Israeli stuff, as being part of how God is unfolding this apocalypse. Does that help explain how they've been able to kind of because back when I was training, the Falwells and people like that, they were always calling for, we need great moral leaders in the White House. We need Christians in the White House, so that's all completely gone by the wayside, right? And
Right.
and I think one of the things that helps me understand that is simply because they see this current regime as being part of this dispensational process. Is that fair?
Certainly for some of them, that's the case. This is the $1 million question: is how do there's a million explanations for
Yeah.
why evangelicals have supported Trump in such numbers. I think part of it is that, at least for some evangelicals, Trump fits into a meta story that, aligns with their end times theology and other things. That means that that's his primary role. I mean, earlier in his first administration, there were a lot of comparisons to Cyrus the Great,
Right,
as sort of
right.
a pagan ruler who did God's will. That wasn't necessarily a prophetic thing. I mean, that was more actually a historical sort of analogy than one about the future. But you can see there, you can rationalize a lot if you're saying, well, as long as the output is Christian, or what I deem as Christian, then I don't really care what goes into it. I think on the other end, on the prophecy side, it's such a diverse landscape. This is part of you could say it's a problem, but it's just a state of affairs with dispensationalism, is because it's so popular. I mean, there's no, in the academic world, there's like a sort of standard dispensationalism or an orthodox view, and then a bunch of, deviations. There's no such thing in the culture like that. There's no original dispensationalist view. Even Hal Lindsey took many liberties with what he was taught at Dallas Seminary when he popularized it. And so there are all types of theories and books that sell quite well, purporting to tell you how Trump is fitting into the future, how the Gaza war is fitting into the future. And so you just know that this is an important dynamic. And I think that the sort of underlying logic of most of those is that, in a way, it sort of dehumanizes Trump. Like, Trump is not a person in the way most of us think of persons. He is a figure in prophecy. Like, he has a role to play. And as long as he plays that role, it doesn't really matter what else he does, because his legacy and his significance is about playing that role. And so I think when you start getting into the prophecy analysis of really anything happening in the Middle East, unfortunately, I mean, I don't shed too many tears over Trump being dehumanized as the figure of prophecy, but other people in the region do get that treatment as well. Basically, everyone, once there's sort of a set script that will be fulfilled, human agency is sort of a secondary concern at that point. And so whether you're the perpetrators or the victims or the enablers or just the superpower, from across the sea that's interacting with these things, they're all just pawns in a scheme that has already been prescribed through prophecy. And that's one of the dangers of I think, Luke, you said it earlier, sort of Sunday school interpretations of them. If that's all you have, and nothing against Sunday school, my kids go to Sunday school, but it's like you want to complement that with other types of knowing and other ways of interpreting, and you want to find sort of how these things mesh together. And a purely Sunday school reading of the Middle East or of American politics leads you into some pretty fatalistic ways of thinking about the world. And that fatalism can lead you to actually act. It can lead you to want to be on the side that you are certain is going to win. But it can also let you look over a lot of things that if you're in some other part of your life where you're not fatalistic would really be sort of like red flags about this person or their positions. Those just go away because they're not really part of the meta narrative that is animating your thinking.
You brought up Cyrus, and yes, he has been brought up a number of times in regard to Trump. But I also think it's no coincidence that bringing up the issue that Cyrus is the one who lets the Jews go rebuild the temple, right?
Right.
So you can see
That's right.
even with Cyrus, there's a connection there, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. There's a particular connection with the Jewish people
Yeah.
and with empowering. Yeah. It's sort of being the redemptive agent of God's plan with
Right.
the Jewish people. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so gentlemen, I had mentioned earlier that I was going to refer to this dispensationalism as a mind virus. I'm borrowing a phrase that I've heard in the culture. And I said I wanted to talk about the three manifestations of this disease, this infection. And the first of those was going to be about how it's come out in American politics, in our thinking. And we've covered a lot of that already. I don't want you to repeat all of that, but things like Zionism, things like you mentioned earlier, this prosperity gospel. But I haven't heard yet Christian nationalism, or at least not a lot. I don't know if Project 2025 is too stale a topic. So let's talk a little bit about that first symptom of this dispensationalism, the whole political ramifications, the effect on the American people.
Yeah. So one thing to just note is if you took, Trump has this like spiritual advisory council, and it's full of, major leaders from the largely evangelical world. If you line them all up and were to classify them by theology, there would be some dispensationalists there, but they would not be the majority. That's something to just keep note, is that dispensationalists are not sort of uniformly the people that Trump is consulting, including his personal spiritual advisor, Paula White. She's not a dispensationalist. She is a charismatic Christian with a very, you could say, heterodox theology. She's a mix of a bunch of different things that are largely, most card-carrying dispensationalists would reject her theology on a lot of things. So even, Trump's chosen spiritual advisor isn't that. There are other people that are, people like Robert Jeffress, the pastor down at First Baptist Dallas, who's very prominent on Fox News. He's a dispensationalist. He's a sort of a classic dispensationalist. John Hagee is, as I mentioned, a dispensationalist. So there are significant dispensationalists. So they have been part of, but not the drivers of, the MAGA Christian world. I think the notable thing is at least those figures are, and their followings are very comfortable in that world. So it's almost remarkable to see very Pentecostal, charismatic Christians alongside dispensationalists. Like that for an American religious historian is like, you don't see that very often until basically the 90s. And you really don't see it in the way you see it now until the 2010s. Those used to be very strong dividing points. One of the people breaking that down was Jerry Falwell, who was willing to work with charismatics on abortion and other issues that were domestic policy issues. But even there was a lot of suspicion. And in that setting, Falwell was in the driver's seat. Like, he was the leader, and he wanted to reach out to these charismatic Christians, these Pentecostal Christians. Today, it's the Pentecostals and charismatics who are in the driver's seat. If you look at Christians United for Israel, which is the largest lobby group of Christians supporting Israel, this is the group that John Hagee founded. If you look at their board of directors, it is entirely Pentecostal megachurch pastors, except for one legacy seat for a Falwell, because it was founded in 2006. Jerry Falwell died in 2007. He got a seat on the board, the original board of directors. He died the next year, and his son, Jonathan Falwell, who's the pastor at their church, the old Thomas Road Baptist Church, was the next person to take that board seat. Everyone else on that board is not Baptist or, in theological terms, cessationist. Jerry Falwell didn't believe in speaking in tongues or in any of that stuff. That was his tradition. And that's the traditional dispensationalist tradition. But everyone else on Christian United for Israel is in that world. So it's just important to know that dispensationalists aren't the main drivers of this. That being said, they have a long history of raising up a certain vision of America that is really in line with the Republican Party, or used to be, sort of dictated by the Republican Party, family values, pro-Christian. A lot of the debates in the 80s and 90s were about, is America founded as a Christian nation, and what were the stakes on that? That's still something that's debated. And dispensationalists are very involved in that. My argument in my book on dispensationalism is that they're involved with it, though, differently than the Paula White types. The Paula White types actually believe their calling as Christians is to take over the culture in order to basically create a Christian country that will then be the kingdom of God on earth. They're what we call post-millennialists. They think that they have to basically reform society in order for Jesus to come back, and that society must be Christian. So you can hear terms in the news like dominionist or reconstructionist, and these are all people in that stream who have a very different eschatology than dispensationalism. Dispensationalists are premillennialists. They think the world's going to sort of fall apart before Jesus comes back, and then Jesus will establish that millennial kingdom. And so in the 70s and 80s, this was a big question. Like, if you're premillennialist, if you're dispensationalist, why would you get involved in politics? And the answer that they gave was that there's a new threat on the horizon called secular humanism. They sort of created a term for it. And that secular humanism was going to take over the country, much like communism was taking over other countries. And that if they did that, then they would outlaw Christianity, or they would make it very hard to be a Christian. And then the dispensationalists could not practice their faith, and they couldn't evangelize the rest of the world, because if the church is outlawed, then they're not going to have the resources and the reach that they have. So this was the argument that Jerry Falwell and Tim LaHaye made. And so they couched it within their dispensational theology, which got them to be politically active and to support Reagan and to support that vision of America. But it was a much different motive than the dominionists or the reconstructionists, who said, well, actually, it's our job to do this. It's not about sort of a rearguard action to make sure that the church can evangelize. It's about actually our job is to take over the culture. So today, those two groups, sort of intermix, and they can get on the same page with a lot of different political things. But they're different. And it's been a notable shift over the last 20, 30 years that the post-millennial dominionist types are now way more prominent than they used to be, and are at the heads of a lot of these charismatic Pentecostal organizations. There's another term that's often used for that group. It's called the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR, which is this sort of network that a lot of these Paula White type people have. It's very informal, because these are all sort of mega churches with personalities that are sort of at the center of the ministries. But it's a network where there's a lot of sharing of resources and people. And that is really the dominant, you could say that's like the mega Christian base, is the NAR. And they're pretty anti-dispensationalist in their theology. So I don't want to deflate the bubble too much, but it's just like it's a complicated landscape, and dispensationalists are part of it. And they actually sort of, if we back up, they tilled a lot of the ground in the 80s and 90s to get to where we are today. But as of today, they're not nearly as prominent as they were in the, say, George W. Bush era or the Clinton era, where they were basically the only game in town in terms of national evangelical leaders.
Okay, so let's now move away from this set of symptoms. Again, I'm referring to dispensationalism as a mind virus, and this is the set of symptoms that gives us all the attention on Israel and the end times that comes with that, gives us Christian nationalism. We've talked about those things. I want to talk about another set of symptoms of this virus. And this comes out of the dispensationalist idea that, again, we're in the end times, and after all those things happen, Armageddon, etc., then the world's going to be burnt, going to be thrown in a lake of fire and a new earth. So this apocalyptic ending, that kind of erodes the motivation for young people to make any plans for the future and try to make a dent in society. And it erodes the motivation of people in general to take care of the planet. I want to give an example from my own personal experience, and then we'll talk more generally. But personally, in the late 70s, when I was just wrapping up high school, I did go through a phase when I questioned whether it was worthwhile to go to university, despite thinking all through childhood that I was going to be a doctor. I remember ever since grade 3, I was going to be a doctor. But now, and of course, getting married, I intend to get married. But simply because Jesus was coming back in the early 80s, which is when I was going through these thinkings, and we were absolutely convinced of that idea, I was thinking, why bother with marriage and why bother with a career? So it really eroded that. And at the same time, this is another aspect of my personal experience, when society was wrestling with the problems of the big ozone hole in the stratosphere and the silent spring, all that thing about the DDT killing off all the insects, killing the birds. and global pollution in general, I was one of those people. I remember thinking, and I'm not sure I said it out loud, but I was thinking none of that really mattered because it would only be a few more years when the earth gets tossed into the lake of fire anyway, so who cares? It's all going to burn, right? And we see this same mentality today when we talk about global warming or climate collapse, the oil industry, drill baby drill. As Fox News host Sean Hannity said a couple of years ago in response to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's warnings about the climate crisis, Hannity said, "If the world really is going to end in 12 years, to hell with it all. Let's have one big party for the last 10 years and then we'll all go home and see Jesus." So, gentlemen, there's this second set of symptoms, a carelessness about the ecology, the environment, the future.
Yeah, here at the Lumen Center, I have a colleague. His name is Rick Lindroth. He's been in this sort of creation care space for many decades now, and this is one of his big challenges. He works with an organization called BioLogos, which is the whole job is to try to create more science literacy in the church. So we talk about this a lot because this is one of the things he sort of loses sleep over at night is this. So what I want to say is that there's a lot of reasons why dispensationalists would not be interested in the environment that we can talk about, including the fatalism and the stuff we talked about before. But one of them that is really important is dispensationalism is, among other things, a hermeneutic for reading the Bible. So once you're a dispensationalist, you end up interpreting verses in certain ways because of your priors that you're bringing to the text. And so one of the key verses for the dispensationalist view of the end is 2 Peter 3:10-11. So I'm just going to read them now, and I'll give you why that matters. It says, "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives." So that's the text. And the dispensationalist way of reading this is what I think most people would first pass as like the plain reading. Like, this is a very clear prophecy or prophetic utterance by the author of 2 Peter. He's saying the Lord is going to come like a thief, heavens will disappear, earth destroyed by fire, earth is bare. And then, also the implication, you should live holy and godly lives. And for the dispensationalist, the holy and godly lives are totally disconnected from all the things that are going to be destroyed in the verse before it. So in some sense, it's up to each Christian to sort of like, what do you do with that verse? Like, is that just figurative language? As someone like N.T. Wright, who I've mentioned, would say, we are so conditioned in American culture to read this in the dispensationalist way that we actually overread what is happening here. Nothing in this says that all of what God originally created in Genesis is going to be destroyed and that we're going to sort of like reset from beginning. For N.T. Wright, there are elements of the current order that will be destroyed, and there will be a way where heaven comes down to earth. But for someone like N.T. Wright, there will still be the oceans and the lakes of this world today in the next world. And so it's very incumbent upon Christians today to take care of it because these are the sort of eternal resources that we're going to have in the next world. Well, dispensationalists have long rejected that reading, and I would say it's seeped into American culture. And these are the types of verses that they point to and say, in some sense, caring about the environment for the unforeseeable future is actually against God's will, or it's actually, you're not being godly if you put so much faith in what humans can do to control the environment today. So there's a contrast of sort of human action and godly action. And it's the sort of like the more you emphasize the human action, the more you're questioning God's sovereignty or God's agency. And then, as I mentioned before, you're also sort of reading the first verse about the day of the Lord as a sort of, I can imagine most people in their head, they're actually thinking like a movie. Like there's a visual to this, which is like something like the Late Great Planet Earth cover, which is like the Earth engulfed in fire. And like, basically, it's almost like we're going to have Earth 2.0. Like there's almost no relation to Earth 1.0. It's an entirely new operating system or something like that. Where I think a better analogy would be something more like, in biblical terms, the flood in Genesis 6-8. That's the story of God flooding the whole earth. But it's the same earth. The features of the earth, the systems that make the earth habitable, the oceans and the land, like that's all still there before and after the flood. And I think that's a different way to read how does God do these cosmic events. There was a dispensationalist theologian back in the 70s or 80s who was speculating on what would the new heavens and new earth be like, given their convictions that they're going to be entirely different from the current earth. And so we shouldn't really care, we don't have it invested in this current earth. And he speculated, and this was in like an academic text, that we actually need to look to like science fiction and like other planets like Mars to get a better sense of what the new heavens and new earth are versus the actual earth we have today. And that's sort of like where that logic takes you. But it leads to a lack of care, you could say, about creation care. And it also leads to this ascribing devious motives to people who do care about the earth, because it's either they're putting too much trust in man's agency over these things, or it's because of like the political interests that are driving that type of care that are against what they consider to be sort of godly interests. So that whole sort of bundle, but I think a big part of it goes back to how do you read the Bible? Because these are most of the people who come out of this culture are very biblical people. Like they have chapter and verse for a lot of the things they do in their life. And here's a chapter and verse telling you shouldn't really care about the earth because it's going to be destroyed by fire. So you got to reckon with that.
Right. Those are really important points. It's to me one of the tragedies of the modern kind of Christian world in its evangelical form is that it is so opposed to creation care. This is an area where we could make common cause, right? Like the church could join with secular folks to say, yeah, we also agree that and in fact, maybe we even have better reasons because we believe God created it and so on. So, but instead of that, we have this opposition and this suspicion that you're compromised if you care about the worth. And it isn't helped, frankly, by some of the voices on the secular side either. E.O. Wilson wrote a book a few years ago, a letter. I think it's just a small book, a letter to the Christian church or something along those lines, talking about the environment. But the whole thrust of the book is to really talk down and more or less just say, you're idiots. And that's not going to help either, right? And so
Right.
there definitely could be some better efforts made on both sides of the equation. I hear what you're saying, and I think it's, again, dispensationalism feeds into that, but not just dispensationalism, just the general idea of many Christians that this is all temporary and we're going to be in heaven someday. So just that whole mindset says we should care, but should we care that much? That kind of thing. Whereas N.T. Wright and others like him are now making the case that we're not going to heaven. There's nowhere in the Bible that it says we're going to heaven. The Bible only talks about a new earth. Like this is where we're going to be. So I see that as a welcome trend, but that's at the academic level right now, not so much, at the popular level.
Right. Well, that's really it's interesting to think about where do Americans get their ideas of heaven?
Yeah.
Which is so bound up in this, both, where you go after you die, but also what's after this age. And, we tend to, if you think of like the commercialized version, it's sort of disembodied. It's not this earth, it's somewhere up in the clouds. And that would lead you to think, yeah, what is the relationship between that and earth? Like, particularly if we're just spirits floating around or something. But that's what's interesting is dispensationalists have it within their tool set and their interest to actually critique that view of heaven for sure. But also, you go up to the end of the Bible, to the end of Revelation, and it's the new heavens coming down out of heaven onto earth. It's not earth sort of like floating up into the mist or something like that. It's actually it coming down. So, you could be very literal about that. You could be a very literal, which is dispensationalists love to be the literalists, the ones who really take these verses at what they're saying. And you could say, okay, so, this earth, sort of heaven's coming down to earth. We're not going up to heaven. But they don't make that move for a variety of reasons. And they have a number of verses like the one I read that make them much more in line, you could say, with a more general American cultural view of heaven, and then of the sort of the sharp break between this age and whatever's coming after this age.
Okay, so we still have a couple good questions on the table here, but right now we're talking about the practical application, why I wanted to do this episode, and it was partly to emphasize that this is not just an American problem. That's what I had thought before, a couple months ago. I realized that this is important to us in a global sense, but also what is the practical application? We've talked about creation care as one practical application, but I think the other one is we need to confront this mind virus in two very different ways. These evangelical ideas, this worldview that comes out of dispensationalism. They're contributing significantly to global events that are setting off fires all around the planet. And I'm saying fires in the metaphorical sense and in the literal sense. In the metaphorical sense, geopolitically, in the Middle East, these ideas are very destabilizing and provocative. They're a self-fulfilling prophecy of Armageddon. Armies from all nations of the world engaged in conflict over a small piece of real estate, a little postage stamp of land, some threatening to put nuclear weapons into action. And also in the literal sense, the careless attitude about environmental and ecological collapse, the idea that it's all going to burn anyway, and the idea that let's accelerate it because that'll hasten Jesus' return. That's accelerating the global warming, which is having all kinds of diverse negative effects on human society, on biodiversity, on the very planet itself, melting the ice at the North and South poles, setting forests ablaze, shutting down the deep ocean currents that distribute heat around the planet. So fires in the literal and the metaphorical sense, and these ideas need to be confronted.
Yeah, at the top of our discussion, we mentioned the fact that, we're not going to get into specific politics and policies and things like that. But I do think it's fair to mention that the Zionist element leads to a belief that this current state of Israel, the current manifestation of Israel, is beyond question in any way. So basically anything that they do, we should support. That's a pretty widespread belief. And that goes back to that Ted Cruz interview where Tucker Carlson is saying to Ted Cruz, well, hold on a minute, is that really right that we just have to support everything that Israel's doing, and that whole discussion, which I thought was in only a way that he can, he really nailed poor Ted Cruz on that issue. And so I do think that implication is very important for us to take into account and to recognize. But
on that point you just said, I mean, that was one of the things that Ted Cruz revealed in that interaction was the assumption that it's really widespread among a lot of American Christians that the modern state of Israel has a continuity with ancient Israel of the Bible and sort of the covenants that God made with Abraham and David and other biblical figures are basically in effect with the modern state of Israel as well. There's a continuity there. And that's a view that many Jews hold as well, including most Israelis. That's sort of their civic religion or the way they talk about their own state is that way as well. But it's something that in the Christian world is pretty controversial outside of conservative evangelical space, even within conservative evangelical spaces, but dispensational spaces. And that's one of those assumptions that I don't think a lot of people think deeply about that. They just assume oh yeah, it says Israel in the Bible. There's a modern state called Israel. That must be the same sort of. It's like a person's name or something. It's Johnny in the history book. It's Johnny today. That must be the same Johnny. There was a moment in 1948 when Israel was established where they were deciding what they were going to name the state, and there was a very strong push to name it Judah. So the state of Judah. And in my more cynical moments, I wonder how much of Christian Zionism wouldn't even work if it was Judah instead of Israel that we were referring to there. But it is Israel. And so there is that assumption. And that among many things is one of the complications of just having a Sunday school understanding of modern Israel is you don't actually appreciate the history of the region, of the people, or of the Jewish people that were part of the founding of Israel after the Holocaust, because it all fits into sort of this meta narrative of ancient Israel instead of the modern.
The paradox is that most Zionists, these were secular people. Many of them were atheists and many communists coming out of Eastern Europe. And even in the US, like leading Jewish intellectuals, they're not religious people. They're very secular folks. But I find it fascinating that when a guy like Netanyahu or other people start talking about Israel, they get very biblical. They become Bible scholars and they become very biblical literalists when I know they aren't, not in the least.
Right. Yeah, well, and Netanyahu is a perfect example of someone who seemingly doesn't really have a religious bone in his body personally, in his personal life, but talks a lot about God's favor on Israel and God's covenant. And part of that is just understanding that for a lot of modern Jews, the Bible is a cultural text, not just a religious text. So they feel fine referring to those things as literary devices or civic religious type ways that Americans have their own way of doing that. But they do play differently, and I'm sure Netanyahu knows this. He's very skilled at it with Christian audiences, who are much more invested in the theology and the metaphysics of all this. And so, I mean, David Ben-Gurion, the original, the first prime minister of Israel, was great at this. He would go in front of American Christian audiences and he would give a biblical story of the struggles of the Jewish people. He would talk about God's covenants. He would talk about Judeo-Christian civilization, Judeo-Christian values. And he would really connect with Christians. And I think he was saying one thing and they were hearing another thing. And it works quite well. So that's a dynamic that's been around for a long time. I don't want to be entirely cynical about it because it's not like it's the only example of this type of way of leaders relating to followers and so forth. I think the interesting thing is that, as Luke said at the beginning, there's a lot of different conflicts around the globe that have these types of dynamics, but there's this one that has so much attention placed on it and so much seemingly sacred significance. That to me is the interesting thing, is like, how do you get that dynamic as opposed to, Korea or Taiwan or all these other places that have a lot of conflict? There is this added weight, and there's this way that invoking God's covenants, you could do that in Taiwan. It's not going to have the same sort of influence as if you're sitting in Jerusalem doing the same thing.
Well, and that feeds into, because I've heard many conservative Christians say that, see, that kind of proves that, look at the odds of this little group of people. First of all, getting a nation. There's only 15 or so million Jews in the world out of the 8 or 9 billion people, right? And it is true that they have an outsized influence on, but they see that's even more proof of God's blessing and of as a central role they're going to play in the unfolding of history.
Right.
Okay, gentlemen, I've got one last question for Daniel. And really, I should give credit to the editor of Christianity Today for this question, Bonnie Christian. I read her review of your book, Daniel, and I thought, I want to ask that one as well. I've been referring to dispensationalism as a mind virus and talking about how it's been infecting people. We've been talking about how it's infected first John Nelson Darby, and then Schofield brought it to evangelicals in general, Christianity in general. And I've wanted to talk about the 3 sets of symptoms that this virus gives us. We've talked about the first and the second, the first one being the effect on American politics, on Middle East policy, the second one being environmental and ecological collapse. But now this third one, it seems to be infecting Western society in general. We talked about how it first gave us the Left Behind series of books and movies that were incredibly successful booksellers and box office hits in Hollywood, but they left a long trail of religious trauma. But that infection may not have stopped there, not only in the Christian community, but even in secular society writ large. Just like the COVID virus jumped species barriers, the mind virus may have mutated into a form that is now infecting secular society. So I want to read a few sentences from a review of your book from Bonnie Christian, again, the editorial director of Ideas and Books at Christianity Today. She wrote about your book, "The theological void left by dispensationalism has not remained empty. Evangelicals and Americans more broadly have only multiplied doomsday speculation since the collapse of dispensational theology in the 1990s. Its remnants in pop dispensationalism have been thrust into an ocean of raging American apocalypticisms that includes doomsayers of the Anthropocene, replacement theory extremists, QAnon trolls, techno-pessimists, and neo-Malthusians. For all the problems that theological apocalypticism posed in the 20th century, it is likely that irreligious apocalypticism in the 21st will prove to be even more disruptive." So, Daniel, has dispensationalism mutated into a new, more virulent form of a mind virus? It's stoking fires of doomsday beliefs in Western society in general. All the books and movies and podcasts about the end of the world, the zombie apocalypse, the great pandemic that's bound to hit us, World War III, and alien invasions. Is this coming from dispensationalism?
I don't think it's just coming from dispensationalism, but I think dispensationalism has given American culture one of the most easily accessible tools to talk about these things. I actually published an article probably a little over a year ago in the magazine Comment, which is one of these sort of Christian thought magazines, about the broader, it was sort of a try to answer Bonnie's challenge, a broader sense of decline in our culture and where does that come from? I think a big part of it has to do with just taking a much wider sweep of American history, realizing that for most of American history, our culture believed in progress, believed that every generation would have better living standards, that the United States would be more powerful in the world. And that's really a consistent theme from, you could say the founding of the nation, at least through the Civil War, so the first 100 years. And even after the Civil War, there's still a very strong progressive streak. It's always fun to go back to like the 1893 Chicago's Fair and see like what they were predicting would be the world of 1950 or the year 2000. Very optimistic, big faith in science, big faith in democracy as these sort of engines of progress. And a big part of the answer of where we're at today is that all dissipates, or not all, but it significantly dissipates from the center of American cultural conversation. And you could say this even still at the height of our culture after World War II. It seems like there's never been a more powerful country in the history of the globe than the United States in the late 1940s. Of course, the Cold War creates a new sort of set of tension points. But even if you go to the Nixon-Khrushchev kitchen debate, where they're debating which kitchen is more impressive, the Soviet kitchen or the American kitchen, Nixon is like a missionary for American consumerism. This is going to solve all the problems of home life. This is going to solve, family values are going to be at the center. And so we're really looking at sort of the 1960s and 70s of when a lot of this falls apart. And there's an interesting sort of passing of the torch from a very prominent progressive view of history to one that's very declensionist and pessimistic that aligns with dispensationalism. And you say premillennialism more generally, the idea that the world is getting worse and worse and will sort of collapse before some type of outside force will revive it or start the new era or something like that. And in that sense, dispensationalism is the most popular version of how to talk about that. At least it was. I don't know if it is right now, but in the 70s and 80s, the number of movies and books, even before the Left Behind books, that had sort of the rapture as a plot device, that had a one world dictator as somehow part of the big problem that is going to have to be overcome. These are very distinct theological ideas from dispensationalism. You can even think like the Omen. If you remember the Omen in the 70s, sort of the idea of like the Antichrist as a kid, and you come to find out the guy who wrote the Omen in 1975 was a recent born again Christian who was introduced to Christianity through a dispensationalist sort of presentation. The more subculture, Thief in the Night, all those types of movies had that much more prominently. And so my argument in that other article was that dispensationalism did not cause this. It's not like dispensationalists have more power than Hollywood or like these other parts of our culture that have a lot of power in shaping how we think about the future. But once there was an opening for a declensionist, pessimistic take on the future, dispensationalism was one of the most accessible ways to talk about it. And particularly like the idea of the rapture, which is like if you just pull back, it's such a distinct Christian teaching that is so marginal to Christian history until the 20th century. Even in the 19th century, like the number of people who believed in the any moment rapture, you could get them all in like a stadium or something.
Yeah.
Like it's so small compared to if you think about Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, all the other Protestant branches. And then by the end of the 20th century, even the non-religious American, if you say, hey, what's the rapture? They will give you basically the teach. It's like, oh yeah, all the real Christians go up into heaven or something like that.
Right.
That is just a remarkable career for an idea like that. And I think part of the answer is that it fit in with this declensionist view of the world, because the rapture is going to happen when everything's going bad, and that it slipped the bonds of any theological system. And it just became this way of talking about the suddenness of the decline, or sort of there's going to be some chosen few who will make it through whatever is going to happen. And that to me is the remarkable power of dispensationalism. Now, that's impressive to me as a cultural historian. If I'm a theologian, it's not really impressive at all, because that idea of the rapture is not tied to any system of teaching in the way that most theologians would want their theology to be tied to. But yeah, so dispensationalism remains popular in part because we remain a very pessimistic culture. And I try to acknowledge that even in the book, that it's not just about, sort of a supernatural apocalyptic end. It is the environmentalist vision of the future that is very bleak in terms of human prosperity flourishing. It's the view of democracy's had its best days that are behind it, and now we're into an era of authoritarianism. It's AI and, wondering, is the future going to be basically run by non-humans and computers? All those types of things, like even the imaginative space to get to where basically none of these things have good potential. Overall, they all have really bad potential. That to me is indicative of what you could say is a premillennialist. If we were post-millennialist in the first half of our history, and we believe that we were actually ushering in the kingdom of God through manifest destiny and democracy, we're like in the opposite now, which is we are really trying to manage the decline and find out sort of how do you get on the life raft when everything's literally going to hell. So that to me is the bigger cultural landscape within which dispensationalism is the lingua franca of at least part of that. But it's not, it doesn't dictate that. And I think, there will be other models, including things like zombie apocalypse, like these things that aren't even religious, that are also quite popular, that will probably displace the traditional dispensationalism as more and more of American culture becomes post-Christian. If the sociologists are right, the younger generations are far less familiar with dispensationalist concepts than were boomers or Gen Xers, and even millennials like me who grew up in the sort of left behind heyday. Unless there's a resurgence of that, my guess is there will be other ways that Americans talk about this that are less tied specifically to dispensationalism and tied to whatever else is popular in the culture.
Okay, so we're going to draw a line under the conversation at that point. You've got two excellent books there on this very timely topic. But is there a third book in the pipeline?
There is. It's on a little different topic. It's another history book. It's looking at debates within American Christianity around ideas of holiness and sanctification, going back about 150 years. And what's interesting to me is trying to trace how evangelicals in particular have thought about psychology, the therapeutic culture that is a big part of our culture today. And what are the ways that they've thought about that going all the way back to the Victorian era, when a lot of the ideas about the self and God and the psyche are really created in that period. So it's still on a lot of the same. Part of the interest of that came out of a lot of the people that were boosting dispensationalism in the first half of the 20th century were also boosting something called the higher life movement or the Keswick movement. And these are sort of terms in evangelical theology to describe certain ways of thinking about what it means to be a good Christian or what it means to sort of mature in your Christian life. And so it was interesting to me that they kept packaging dispensational theology with one of these types of ways of being holy. And that got me interested in that trail. But it's a really interesting topic. It's probably not as timely, like there isn't a war happening that relates to these holiness teachings. But I think it has a lot to say about the way that evangelicals think about our contemporary culture, think about things like addiction and the use of medicinal drugs and things like that, and think about the human body and a lot of the political issues that come with that as well. So working on that, I'm about halfway through that. It'll probably be done end of next year if I get the time to write it.
Excellent.
Great. Fantastic.
We'll have links in our show notes for both of those books that we talked about today, and as well how people can find out more about you and probably follow you to see when that third book comes out. But I just want to say, Daniel, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Yeah, fantastic.
It's been a pleasure. Good talking to you all.
And you're getting back to teaching in 2 or 3 weeks like myself, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So enjoy.
All right.
All right. You too.
See you later.
Bye now.
All right. See you guys later.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.